accessible mathematical notation, as well as touch on how to make sure tables are accessible. And these really come down in our 5 principles. The math notation comes into providing text equivalence. And so one of the options is to treat mathematical equations as a figure, an image, and provide the alt text that way. But there is a markup language, MathML, that is relatively universal and works well with assistive technologies. And what it allows browsers, other components to do is use the markup language to draw the mathematical equation and to allow assistive technologies to either read it if it's a screen reader or convert it to a Braille device if that's the desired outlook or output. And so what I want to do is, instead of everybody having to learn how to do all of this, I want to share some relatively simple ways to do it. I'm going to put into this chat the link to the slides if folks want to get to those, and I'll also include a document that lays out some of these things. But math type is something that we have on campus, certainly as a plugin for Google Docs and Google Slides. It can be used as a plugin for Word. It's within Blackboard. I need to go back and check up on a couple things for the full standalone version, either with Windows or in Citrix apps, because I just checked and it wasn't in Citrix apps. So I just need to backtrack that, but it's still available as these add-ons. And that's what I was going to demonstrate primarily today anyway. There is also some of this information on the digital accessibility page in the FAQ of how to do these mathematical equations in notation. I also want to tell you up front, I'll show you an example, but it is possible to copy and paste the equations that you've created between applications, and the alt text is preserved. So what I'm going to do is I just have a blank Google document here. And in the add-ons now, you should have math type as an option, and you can do insert mathematical equation. And it brings up an equation editor that probably looks similar to one you've used in Word or other applications. But this allows you to basically write whatever equation problem with thinking about doing this on the fly. And so here's my equation. I can change the font and the size if I think it needs it. Maybe I don't want it italic, but pretty much any mathematical function notation that you would want is available in this system, and it's just a matter of going through it. There's also the option of handwriting if you're doing it on a tablet, as opposed to trying to do it with a mouse the way I've just done. And so I'm going to go back to the keyboard version, get rid of the minus sign. And then you just insert that equation. And so it's there. And if I right click on this to get to this menu, I can go down and look at the alt text. And here's all the I've got the title and its begin, math size, and so forth. Straight K equals EA function number. But then this is the MathML coding that's used to render that equation and works with assistive technologies. And so that's how that works. And like I said, I can copy that, pop over to Word, paste it, and oh, why didn't the alt text not come over? I wonder if that's changed. Doesn't matter. We could copy it out of the Google Doc and then paste it over. I've pretty much just been doing things within Google Docs directly. Right. In Blackboard, this function plugin that you see actually does go to MathML coding and the math type plugin, so that you can do examples there. I'm going to show you a code example. This is quadratic formula. And I'm guessing that most people, when they look at this, are going to think, oh my, how am I supposed to remember and keep track of all of that? Unless you really want to get into it, you don't have to. Math type generates it all for you. I have encountered occasional browser issues, particularly if you include this in Blackboard assignments. And this script right here, if you put this in the instructions of your Blackboard assignment, it makes it more likely that whatever browser students are using will interpret the MathML okay. It seems to be the biggest problem in Chrome, because a few years ago, Chrome decided that MathML wasn't universal enough and there might be some security issues, and so they dropped direct support for it. But this little JavaScript allows it to work. That's the one difference issue that we've have encountered. I also have this document, which I'll create a share and put in the link. So this is a document that I wrote up that really summarizes what I've just talked about. And for those of you in the mathematics area that are really comfortable with doing things in LaTeX, there are converters that allow you to convert from LaTeX to MathML. There are also MathML editors where you can, if you really want, code directly in MathML and render it. And here's one of them that I've looked at. So there's all of the code, and then you can say preview and it'll render it. And in this case, it's not just the equation, but it's other parts of the sentence problem that then are all rendered here in MathML and HTML. So you can get yourself pretty buried if you want into the coding and set stuff up. Questions, things you want to see about dealing with math equations?
Yeah, I have a question actually.
Yep.
You said that it's available for Word, for Microsoft Word, but we have to ask CTS. So
Yep.
Does that mean we have to get a license from them?
That's the way the standalone version was working. You should be able to just pull it in as a plugin. I did it a couple of years ago, so I don't remember.
Because I remember when it was like $40 or $80, and we were basically told the department has to pay for it. That is no longer the case.
It should not be the case. A couple of years ago, when the first year of the accessibility fellows, and I was part of my project task was to work this out, and really kind of identified that math type was the most reasonable, efficient plug-in, add-in software to make things accessible. And at that point, CTS bought a campus-wide license and the add-ins. And until when I looked today, it also had been available within Citrix apps directly. And so I'm going to be reaching.
How does that work with the Citrix apps when you're doing this in Word?
So within Citrix apps in the full version of math type, you just create your equations and you save them
Oh, okay.
as equations, and the alt text is brought along with them. And so you save them as image files, the alt text is there, you paste them in to Word.
I did just try adding it. I have my own license for this, and I think it was like about $35 or so, or maybe that's just the update. But I got a message saying that Microsoft 365 has been configured to prevent individual acquisition and execution of Office Store add-ins. So the campus is blocking the use of this in Word.
Yeah,
If
so they've
you
got to
have Word
open
through
that.
the campus.
Yeah, so there's a hiccup there that's kind of developed, and the full shift to Office 365 probably affected some of this. I didn't do my homework, so to speak, and check this before 10 minutes before we were starting, but I'll go back out with CTS and chat with them and see where we are in this, and report back to you, Magdalena, about how to proceed. But at this point, I don't believe departments should have to procure it on their own.
Okay.
It looks like it's a change in the way in which we can use Office, that they're blocking it, which means even though I'm paying for it, I'm no longer going to be able to use it on my Windows machine as well. Well, at least not within Word.
Which is kind of unfortunate, but we'll talk with folks and
eventually they'll fix it. Yeah.
Yeah. It does, as I showed, work within Google Docs. And to be honest, we converted all our Gen Chem lab things to Google Docs. I've been converting syllabi to Google Docs, and just deploying things there. And like you said, the copy and paste, the simple thing is, if the alt text isn't going to transport over, is just, that's another step, I know, but you can copy and paste it. That's, that's MathML. As you look at the code, some of it might make sense to you, but with the add-on, you don't really have to know the code. All right. For tables, which we also do sometimes in science and math and so forth. The simple fact of the matter is, for tables, try to avoid using a table just to make things look nice. I know in a document, it's really easy to make a table and have everything lined up in certain places and everything else, but that's not very accessible, and it certainly doesn't contain data. And so the key thing is, tables should be used to present data and information, not just to organize it. And to make a table accessible, you need to be sure that you defined headers, whether it's a row or a column, that the header rows repeat if the table's really big and it goes to a second page. You want to keep the structure simple and don't merge or split cells to try and make things align. And you want to be absolutely sure that you've got your tables accessible before you generate a PDF file. And what I want to do is make everyone aware from the digital accessibility, wrong thing. Ignore that chat message. From the digital accessibility page, we have already a whole set of written and video tutorials that Kate Percival primarily has put together. And in the case of Microsoft Word, it deals with several things we've been talking about, but it also talks about using tables. And so if you open the document for using Microsoft Word in a Windows-based machine, comes down through here, and there's a section for creating accessible tables, and I'm going to talk about that. There's a similar for Google Docs, for PowerPoints, for slides, and so forth. In Word or PowerPoint, when you do a table, you go to the Insert tab, select a table, pick its size, and the table gets put in place. It's a similar type of thing within PowerPoint. You add the table, pick its size, put it in place. What's really key in all of these is that you identify header rows and columns. It might be just one, might be just a header row, might be just a header column, it might be both. And I'll show you an example of what I'm kind of talking about. And that functionality is over in the design tab when you're highlighted on a table. There's also in the layout part of tables, a place where you can be sure that you repeat the header rows or columns that you've identified. All right. And Google Docs, same kind of thing. We're going to insert a table, pick its size, drop it in, start putting numbers in. How we define the headers in Google Docs is just a little bit different. And I'm going to pop over to this document just so we have it. Because what you need to do is select a row or a column and pick the header style and identify it that way. There's not a simple little button the way there is in Word. You actually have to use the style to identify it as a header, either row or column or both. When would you have one, the other, or both? Here's an example that I want to show you. So we've got a header row where we're talking about various fruits, the price per pound, the weight per bag, the total cost. And we have a header column that is the list of all of the fruits. And so this first row in this first column, you could think about as sort of unchanging, or they're the labels for the table. And all of the other cells are the data for the table. And so it's really key that you identify those header rows and header columns if they're present. All right. And that doing that simple task of identifying header columns, header rows, makes your table immensely more accessible. There's, as we said, several other things that you want to keep in mind. You know, you want to style them, try not to leave empty cells, don't merge cells. You know, use color sparingly and appropriately, making sure you follow color contrast standards, keep the structure pretty simple. And if you really need to lay things out in a couple columns, use the columns feature to lay things out in that columnar form, as opposed to trying to enforce it with a table. All right. Questions on those? So there's one more day of the challenge. Tomorrow morning, Gene Halligan, Dan Lader are going to talk about accessibility checkers, which Grackle in the Google Docs environment is a really good accessibility checker. At 1 o'clock, the level up session is dealing with PDF accessibility, because in general, PDFs are really not very accessible. And if they can be avoided, my preference now is to avoid them. We have the drop-in session today at 2 o'clock. We'll have drop-in session tomorrow at 2 o'clock. And all next week, the drop-in sessions will still happen between 2 and 2:50, even though the challenge is formally over. There's a few other accessibility workshops that are going to happen next week that I want to be sure folks are aware of. On the 18th, there's one about the psychology of accessibility needs. On the 19th, making sure you have accessible emails. And then the one at 1 o'clock on the 19th that Rebecca Michter is leading in the 3 pillars. This will address, student experiences and several other components, and be aware that it's a different Zoom link to connect to that. And so that'll be a different connection than you've used for all the other accessibility training workshops. But You can also reach out to any of us on the work group for accessibility or any of the other accessibility groups. Those are all in the digital accessibility website. But I hope that you have a little better understanding of how to deal with mathematical notation and making sure tables are as accessible as possible from the session today. That cover everything for you, Magdalena?
Hopefully.
It's a lot. That's one of the reasons this is a level up session. It's not as broadly applicable, but I think the couple little things we've shown as far as dealing with the headers within tables and using math type simplify that a little bit. It doesn't negate the fact that it requires work to go back and create all of these things, but if you already code with LaTeX, you may want to talk with Elizabeth Wilcox and work with the converters from LaTeX to MathML that I know she's done some with too.
No, I actually kind of avoid LaTeX. So
okay.
Yeah.
Me too. I've never used it.
I have, and when I found out equation editor way back,